I think that is a bearish prediction for Bitcoin going forward. I think like if Bitcoin is $3 million by the year 2050, that's a compound annual growth rate of like, I think still less than 20%. If you just look at like Saylor's Bitcoin 24 model, like he's kind of projecting like 30 something percent at least compound annual growth rate for his base case, which I think is kind of more in line.
Joe Burnett has established himself as a notable figure in the Bitcoin space with his in-depth analyses of Bitcoin's role in modern finance. Former product manager and head analyst at Blockware Solutions, he's now the senior product marketing manager at Unchained, a Bitcoin-only company offering non-custodial cold storage solutions and several financial services related to Bitcoin.
We could potentially reach gold's market cap like, very, very quickly, 18 months. If everyone is on the number go up train for the S&P 500, soon everyone is going to be on the number go up train for Bitcoin. It's kind of the same idea. Once you realize that you shouldn't have your wealth necessarily in the S&P 500, you should have your wealth in Bitcoin because it's a better long-term store of value. And so Bitcoin is going to just continue to become this like, wait a second, I bought this house many years ago for 100 Bitcoin, and now it's worth 7 Bitcoin or whatever it might be today. Like that's a pretty extreme loss of purchasing power that you could have had if you had just, bought actual Bitcoin.
Mr. Joe Burnett, thank you so much for joining me today and being a playable character in a sea of non-playable characters. Thank you, sir.
Awesome. Brandon, thanks for having me.
Yes. So good to have you. You are a wealth of knowledge on Twitter for anyone who's been in the Bitcoin space for a while now, and amassed quite a following, just tweeting out your thoughts, quite honestly, all the research that you're doing, worked at numerous Bitcoin companies. There's so many things going on, and we can't touch on them. We could sit here for hours touching on all of them. Between the ECB attacks, the Fed here attacking Bitcoin, the political shenanigans going on just all over the place. At the end of the day, Bitcoin, as we see it, it's sound money, and it's something that can return, really, freedom, purchasing power back to human beings, and really align incentives together. What's the big thing? Whether it's just that and just your overall outlook on how Bitcoin is changing the world, but maybe some things that you're really kind of focusing in on right now.
Yeah, it's definitely a great question. The way I've always thought about Bitcoin is freedom money or money that can't be debased. And I think that like a lot of people hear about Bitcoin being, there's only going to be 21 million coins, and maybe they're initially skeptical of that, or they don't necessarily think that that's what generates value for Bitcoin. But I think like once you dive deeper into what exactly Bitcoin is, and you realize that Bitcoin is just a form of money, and society inevitably converges on one best monetary tool. And it does this via a natural free market process of converging on a specific tool with specific monetary properties, whether it's portable, durable, divisible, scarcity, etc. Over time, like more and more people are just realizing this is exactly what's been occurring or what historically has occurred throughout thousands of years of history. And there's just been, periods of different societies converging on different forms of money. And like, that's just been the history of humanity. And ever since, the invention or discovery of Bitcoin, society has been actively converging on Bitcoin as the best form of money. And I still think that, 99.99% of people have not grasped that idea at all. And I think even people like within the Bitcoin community probably, have grasped that to some extent and have a significant allocation to Bitcoin. But I still think most people, even within the Bitcoin community, are probably too bearish on what exactly this thing could become in the long run. And so, yeah, I'm just excited to be in the space working for, a Bitcoin only company and helping people, learn more about Bitcoin, buy Bitcoin, hold it in cold storage, and enable them to, hold Bitcoin through the next few decades, because I don't think Bitcoin's volatility is going away anytime soon. Personally, I think it's going to get potentially even get more volatile. It's going to, keep going up in a pretty massive way. And I think a lot of people that don't exactly know what they own, they'll continue to get shaken out, as we've seen like throughout history. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm at today. You can take that wherever you want, but that's kind of a very high level overview of how I'm thinking about Bitcoin right now.
What do you see? Yeah, one of the things you said there, we're going to get to numerous things here. One of them that just made me think of was that chart that was going around in I think the last week or so. The one I saw Natalie Brunel posted, but I saw it in numerous places, but the one I clicked on was hers when she posted, but it was the chart of like the 50 topics of what voters care about. And it was like, nailing the problems, right? The inflation, jobs, the economy. So all three the same ish things, we'll call it. And then the answer being the bottom, which is cryptocurrency, unfortunately. And it didn't just say Bitcoin, but cryptocurrency. And it was, they're 50 apart, literally the top and the bottom. What, like when you see that, I know I had like my own black pill, like, oh, like we are so far away. Like when you see that, or you kind of see those stats thrown about, are you hopeful? Are you black pilled? I mean, like, where are you just like, oh my goodness, what helps you sleep at night? Thinking are we going to need more bad situations and crazy? Is a climate lockdowns coming? What's going to help people start really step changing into this exponential learning curve of like, guys, we have the answer now. We didn't have the answer really technically for thousands of years, but we actually have it now.
Yeah, no, that table was very interesting where it did show like voters, the topics that voters today are most concerned about, I guess, most likely in regards to the United States presidential election that's happening in a week or so. And the top was inflation. The bottom was quote unquote cryptocurrency. And I think when I first saw that, it was both like surprising and then also not surprising, to be honest. Like,
it made it on the list, Joe. At least it made it on the list.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, it is. Yeah, exactly. At least people are, even if it's a very low priority, at least people, had to see that and click respond to the survey or however the survey went out. But yeah, I think generally it was surprising and not surprising. One, it was like surprising in the sense that obviously when you are in the Bitcoin space and you are like a Bitcoin maximalist, or you have adopted Bitcoin as your treasury reserve assets, like what Michael Saylor would say, you would be like, this is insane. Like, the number one priority that people are talking about and concerned about and want the government's help from is literally solved by the least important priority on the list according to themselves, which is like surprising in the sense of like, you're like, wow, like we have the solution exists, the solution is here, and yet no one can see the solution that actually exists. And it's like, it's not even that difficult to see per se. Like if you just zoom out 4 years ago back to 2020, around this time, Bitcoin may have been, $10,000 per coin. Today, it's close to $70,000 per coin. That's a 7x increase in purchasing power in dollar terms in Bitcoin over 4 years. And if you go 4 years behind that, then Bitcoin was like $1,000. That's another 10x or so increase since late 2016. And so it's just fascinating to see that like people haven't been able to grasp that. And I think part of the reason they haven't been able to grasp that is just because Bitcoin is hyper volatile. It's still so new. And like over time, as Bitcoin simply just doesn't die, people are going to have to like come to terms with this thing still exists. The quote unquote experts that they've been listening to, the PhD economists that are going out there and saying that Bitcoin is a worthless tulip bubble, yet it died, 8 years ago, and then it died 4 years ago, and then now it's dead again, but now it's at all-time high. I think more and more people are going to continue questioning the narrative that a lot of these quote unquote experts are saying, and maybe saying like, hey, maybe they're wrong. And there is something there is something important with Bitcoin here. And so I think it's like, back in 2017, I think was like the first time that a lot of people like had their first touch with Bitcoin, at least from my experience. And back then you could write it off as the tulip bubble. 2021, similar experience, but 4 years later, and like people are like, oh, well, like we had this massive wave of fiscal stimulus, like the government was printing money, like everything was going up. So like they didn't really pay too much attention to Bitcoin either in 2020 and 2021. And then this time, I think it might be a little bit different, or at least like it'll be the third, from my perspective, third major time that like normal people within the United States get to see Bitcoin again, and they get to see that Bitcoin didn't die. And then simultaneously this time we'll have the Bitcoin ETFs out there, where we'll have Larry Fink of BlackRock going out there and saying Bitcoin is above governments, like buy Bitcoin because can't be debased. Buy Bitcoin if you think governments are going to continue printing money, and that's exactly what governments are going to keep doing. And so it's like this time around, I think more and more people are going to wake up, and I think the way that people wake up is the number just starts going up. Scarcity begins to reveal itself within the marketplace. The people that understood this before it starts really happening are going to benefit in a big way, and they're kind of pushing up the initial wave of the next parabolic bull market. And then just the nature of Bitcoin is you can't make much more of it. You can only make a certain amount every 10 minutes, and every 4 years it gets more and more scarce. And so once the price starts moving up, there's no natural market-based supply response to satisfy new buyers coming into the market. The only way that you're going to get Bitcoin from the market is to convince older Bitcoiners to sell their coins, which does happen in bull markets, but you got to move the price a lot higher from where it is today to encourage a lot of the older holders to sell out, some of their coins and buy other assets effectively. And I think that it's, to some extent, it's just a matter of time until we get into that next parabolic bull market, and we'll be off to the races.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's funny. I mean, we talked about these problems, and the people, like the voters, no matter what age group, all identified as those were the problems. And I think the thing that's weird is you'd think if you could figure out the problem, you would be searching for an answer. And so I think that's where it's like, are people just not looking? Like they know the problem, but they don't care. They just expect the government to come in and fix it for them. I guess at this point, we kind of have devolved as an American populace, unfortunately, into a little more subservient now than I think we were 100, 200 years ago. And so we just expect other people to do it. Just really fascinating. And to your point too, you made me think of, I always refer to the Google search terms for Bitcoin, just the word Bitcoin, and how we are at a fraction, just like a small fraction of what the 2017 bubble was, like you alluded to, and in the 2021 bubble, we'll say, or just the search terms were so high in 2017. And then it was like a quarter of that actually in 2021 from what 2017 was. And then we're like at a quarter of what 2021 was. So it's just, it makes sense that, again, the voters don't care because no one's really talking about it. I mean, it's wild that we're like all-time highs, but yet people still aren't talking about Bitcoin. It's just, anyway, wild. You just tweeted out recently about Van Eck, and I've seen a bunch of people kind of tweeting this. Gary Cardone, you have, like, there's numerous people I've seen, and just their prediction of, I think it was like $3 million Bitcoin by 2050. And you're just like, great, that's very bearish. Could you explain why you were tweeting that out?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, first, I think he did a good job, like going on CNBC and talking about it. And I think to some extent it is important for like, I don't know if Van Eck would be like traditional finance, but like more crypto Bitcoin finance related. And like, it's important for them to go on and say like Bitcoin is capable of going to millions of dollars per coin. I do think that's very important and great for Bitcoin. But yeah, like, and still being serious, like I think that is a bearish prediction for Bitcoin going forward. I think like if Bitcoin is $3 million by the year 2050, that's a compound annual growth rate of like, I think still less than 20%. If you just look at like Saylor's Bitcoin 24 model, like he's kind of projecting like 30 something percent at least compound annual growth rate for his base case, which I think is kind of more in line. But I still think it's extremely early for Bitcoin. I think like the one way to think about Bitcoin, and I wrote about this in a report titled Your Wealth is Melting that I published earlier this year. The way that I think about Bitcoin is just this one asset where no matter how much time, energy, or resources are poured into creating more Bitcoin, you're not going to be able to create more of it. It's the only perfectly scarce monetary asset that humans have ever discovered. And, you can say that. I don't think people quite realize like what the implications of that really are. Like we have $900 trillion roughly worth of wealth in today's world, whether that's stored in gold, real estate, bonds, or other asset classes, cash. And all of those assets, if humans spend more time or resources trying to produce them, we are going to be able to produce them. And the example of real estate, it's $300 trillion worth of wealth are stored in real estate. Effectively, that's a massive bounty on encouraging other people to go out there and build more houses, build more apartment complexes, even build more land. Like there's an artificial island off the coast of Dubai that's home to thousands and thousands of residents. Like, we can literally create more land if enough wealth is stored in land. That we can't do that with Bitcoin. So we have this $900 trillion pie that if we do keep $900 trillion worth of wealth in these various asset classes, all we're going to be able to do is continue creating more of it. And that's exactly what's happening. Like, we create more real estate, we mine more gold. We, if you store $3 trillion worth of wealth in NVIDIA, VCs are going to fund other chip startups to go and compete with NVIDIA and take away their future free cash flows. And so it's like, we're trying to store all of this wealth in things that shouldn't really hold wealth. And over the long run, they like can't hold wealth as long as humanity continues to be prosperous and grow, and we're able to produce more and more. And then Bitcoin is just this one highly unique monetary asset that no matter how much time, energy, or resources, we're not going to be able to create more of it. And so it's like, if you assume that technological progress continues at the rate that it's been going for the last century, we're going to be able to create so much more abundance in terms of everything else except for Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is kind of like the way that we're going to be able to actually preserve all of this wealth that we've tried to preserve in these like old traditional asset classes that aren't really built for preserving wealth without dilution or without leakage. And that's kind of the title of the report, is like, if you store wealth outside of Bitcoin, your wealth is melting. Like, we're creating more real estate, we're creating more gold, we're building companies that compete with NVIDIA and Apple and Amazon and Microsoft. With Bitcoin, your wealth is not melting. There's only going to be 21 million Bitcoin. And as long as you assume that humanity continues to progress and get more advanced, which I expect, and I think that should be the base case, unless we go into some sort of like crazy apocalypse, which at that point doesn't really matter what you have. I think Bitcoin will be the winner as long as you assume that humanity continues to become more and more prosperous over time.
Do you have a good way of, you made me think of something. Do you have a good way of explaining people? Because I think I couldn't agree with you more. But again, we come back to this problem of clearly, like, everyone sees the problem, but not many of us see the solution. Where like you and I will sit here, or say we go to a Bitcoin conference or whatever, and there's hundreds, thousands of people that we all generally get it, but we see the solution too. Do you have a good way of, I'm trying to think of the best way to say it. Do you have a good way of explaining to people how high Bitcoin can go truly? Other than, hey, we're going to do, some complicated math or whatever. I shouldn't say complicated. It's not necessarily that complicated, but maybe we'll say large numbers. I feel like most people have their eyes glazed over when they hear 900 trillion or whatever it may be, but Bitcoin can go so high, because you just laid it out perfectly. That's what made me think of it, where it's capped. Humans have never experienced it. And maybe that's why we have a hard time, because our brains have to flip. It's counterintuitive, and we've never had to think that way. So it's just very, very tough. Or maybe it's as simple as maybe even this, like, how do you explain to people prices made at the margin, right? Like, I think that's a thing that most people just don't even know, whether it's real estate or Bitcoin. Prices are determined in the margin because it's just what people are willing to sell it for, because not everyone's willing to sell at a given time, right? So how do you kind of see those things, and how do you talk to people about them when it's at a lay level?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, like, in the short to medium term,
if you're liking this interview, but you're just wondering, hey, you know what, Brandon, this is amazing stuff. And I get you have these guests on, and they're talking about how orange pilling the world is so great and how Bitcoin is going to take over the world. How in the world do I educate my family and friends? How do I get people to understand what most people just don't care about, quite honestly? Bitcoin trading cards is the way to do that. When you open up these cards, you see the foil cards, you see the chase, you see the glossy cards, young, old, boy, girl, man, woman, it doesn't matter. People love these cards. It's awesome because they're super valuable, by the way. Amazing little side note. However, it Trojan horses them into the most important thing of the day. It's not politics. It's not all the things that we fight about. It's changing the money, fix the world. Bitcoin trading cards is the best way that we have going in order to do that, no matter who you are. You're going to love them. Playable Characters 10 for 10% off at checkout. Playable Characters 10 off at checkout. btc-tc.com. You're going to absolutely love these things. Now back to the show.
One thing that I've been saying is, like, Bitcoin is at the very least the equivalent of gold. And the market cap of gold is roughly just shy of $20 trillion, I believe. And then if Bitcoin hits that market cap, it's just shy of $1 million right now. And I think that like that could very realistically happen in a relatively short amount of time. And then that's, after that would be a 3x, and then we get to Van X $3 million point, but that's, 2050, which is 26 years away. And I'm saying we could potentially reach gold's market cap like, very, very quickly, 18 months if the bull market plays out, like it has historically. As far as like how high Bitcoin can go, it is kind of hard to explain. The one way that I would think about it, and I've tried to like change people's perspective, is like people create this like diversified portfolio full of all of these different asset classes, and they all think that they're doing pretty well. Like they see their S&P 500, it's going up 10% per year in terms of dollars. They see their gold, their real estate, whatnot. They see all these different assets, and they're like, you know what? Like my wealth is going up. Like it's going pretty well. And it's like, that's not really necessarily what's happening, right? Like if you go to Venezuela and you hold Venezuelan stocks, or you denominate the S&P 500 in Venezuelan bolivars, like yes, your assets look great. You can buy like anything, and the asset that you're holding, denominated in Venezuelan bolivars, looks like it's a fantastic investment because it's going straight up. And so I think people are eventually going to recognize that, wait a second, like the dollar has historically been a fairly useful unit of account. It's still in the short term kind of is, but in the long term, it's not really that useful. Like it's designed to debase against basic consumer goods, and these basic consumer goods are getting more abundant and more plentiful and easier to buy. Yet the prices of these consumer goods are going up because that's by design. Like the dollar's basically pegged to a basket of consumer goods, and it's supposed to debase against that basket of consumer goods by 2% per year. So I think part of it is like helping people shift their mindset away from using the dollar as a long-term unit of account, and recognizing that there might be a better unit of account for long-term wealth out there. And then once you kind of taken that step, you're like, wait a second, I bought this house many years ago for 100 Bitcoin, and now it's worth 7 Bitcoin or whatever it might be today. Like that's a pretty extreme loss of purchasing power that you could have had if you had just, bought actual Bitcoin. And so then it will like kind of recalibrate everyone's brain in the sense that, wait, this is kind of wrong. Like I'm spreading all of my wealth across so many different, eggs and different baskets. In reality, like all of these baskets and eggs are like decreasing in value over time, denominated in an actual more superior form of money. And I think more and more people are eventually going to do that, especially as, we see another bull market come around. And then it's going to be somewhat of a panic, honestly, I guess, because people are going to be like, wow, like I'm losing wealth. Like my wealth is literally melting away, and I have to get a Bitcoin allocation to like kind of lock in what I still have. And that's how that's going to be the best way to preserve and grow wealth into the future. And as technology gets more advanced and humanity gets more advanced, then we'll continue to see natural technology deflation denominated in Bitcoin. And so everything's going to become more abundant. Price of Bitcoin is going to keep going up. And I think like over time, as like that big pie of $900 trillion of all these different asset classes, one will probably keep growing in dollar terms over time, because that's by design. Like the system needs these assets to continue going up in dollar terms, but a lot of that is going to continue to kind of get sucked into the Bitcoin market, and Bitcoin's just going to become an increasing percentage of total global wealth, all at the same time when total global wealth is going to continue expanding as it has in dollar terms, for the last 100+ years. And so, I didn't really answer your question like what the long-term price of Bitcoin could be, but I think it's going to be pretty massive once you just realize it's kind of like Saylor's Bitcoin 24 model, where I think it was Bitcoin 24 model, where he's basically saying like big total wealth is going to keep growing. Like if you're just, optimistic about the future and you assume that the dollar is going to continue to get debased against a basket of consumer goods, and Bitcoin is just going to become an increasing percentage within that total wealth. And obviously it could become a massive percentage once you realize that all of these other assets are stuff that we can just create with additional technology, additional energy, additional, human progress. And Bitcoin just inevitably has to become a larger and larger percentage of the total pie.
Yeah. And it feels inevitable in the sense that, like, that everything you're saying, you have just in the last week, Paul Tudor Jones and Druckenmiller coming out again. It seems like now every 4 years they're going to come out together and like, okay, make this analysis 2 cycles in a row now where they've, front run the bull market, I guess, and went on TV and said, hey, like, this is what it's going to be, guys. Hard assets, gold, Bitcoin, maybe some short dated treasuries just because I need some cash on the side, but that's it. Anyone getting the long treasury is done, like, you're just screwed. So yeah, it's just wild. In saying that, do you have any thoughts? I'm sure you do, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the ECB and I think it was the Minnesota Fed, correct me if I'm wrong, but coming out and really attacking Bitcoin, probably one of the most brazen attacks on Bitcoin over the last week or so. I would love to hear your thoughts on what's been going down in the global central bank world.
Yeah, for sure. I haven't had time to fully read either of those papers yet, but I've seen like the Twitter threads posted by the authors, and I've seen like additional commentary from other people. My understanding with the ECB paper, at least in particular, is like historically they've been saying like, oh, Bitcoin is tulips, Bitcoin's worthless. Like, why are you buying Bitcoin? And then this one kind of like was a shift in sentiment from their perspective, where they're like, wait a second, like Bitcoin's going up really fast. This is unfair. Like now all of the early adopters are benefiting from it in a quote unquote unfair way. And, this is not, basically this is just isn't fair. And it's like, it's kind of a weird argument because like, they should have, if you knew this was going to be the case, you should have bought Bitcoin. And like, you can still buy Bitcoin. Like it's still like, if you're right about it, like if it's going to keep going up and it's going to benefit all the early adopters, well, like 99.9% of the world has not adopted Bitcoin. So like if you buy some now, you will be an early adopter and benefit greatly. And then I think also like one of the things they included, which I kind of agree with, is like they say like the Bitcoin and like broadly the crypto community is like effectively somewhat lobbying the government. Like there are people that want to make sure that Bitcoin rights are protected, and like you can self-custody your Bitcoin, you can buy Bitcoin. Maybe there will be like beneficial taxes towards Bitcoin one day if enough constituents in the United States like want to remove capital gains tax from Bitcoin or something of that nature. And I've kind of been saying that over the last year or so, is like I think a lot of people that are in the Bitcoin community, which is obviously still a very, very small percentage, but Bitcoin is kind of like a single issue voting topic for them. It's like on that list that you mentioned earlier for the broad population, no one cares about Bitcoin. No one cares about crypto. It's like the ECB writes this paper and they say it's unfair, but in reality, like most people, they don't really care. Like they don't think about it. And so like no one really hates Bitcoin except maybe the ECB and like this random person at the Minneapolis Fed that wrote the paper. And still, like I don't even know if they necessarily hate it. They may read their paper and be like, you know what, like if the government's not going to ban it, I should probably buy some Bitcoin, and then they're going to be on team Bitcoin. So like I think like at the end of the day, there's going to be an exponentially growing small percentage of the population that owns Bitcoin and is going to vote for whatever candidate and potentially even donate money to whatever candidate is going to do the most for their Bitcoin. Like if you have a 401k, like it's same with like the S&P 500 at this point. I mean, like most people are not going to vote for the candidate that's going to tank the economy and have all these companies collapse and have everyone lose their jobs. Like everyone is on the number go up train for the S&P 500. Soon, everyone is going to be on the number go up train for Bitcoin. It's kind of the same idea. Once you realize that you shouldn't have your wealth necessarily in the S&P 500, you should have your wealth in Bitcoin because it's a better long-term store of value. And so Bitcoin is going to just continue to become this like important single issue vote. Bitcoiners are going to become more importantly this like single issue voter constituency. And that's going to be really good for Bitcoin because, again, no one, if you're not into Bitcoin, you don't care. If you're into Bitcoin, you care a lot. And so effectively what that means is like every politician is going to have to be pro Bitcoin because you get nothing by being anti Bitcoin because, again, the 99.9% doesn't care about Bitcoin. And then the elections are decided by a very small percentage of people that may not even necessarily go vote. And so if you can attract the pro Bitcoin people by saying, hey, I'm going to start a Bitcoin strategic stockpile and the United States government is going to buy a lot of Bitcoin or whatnot, or at least, protect the right to self-custody or other things, that's going to be really good for Bitcoin. And like, that's going to be something that might actually encourage Bitcoiners to go out there and vote. So yeah, I think like that's kind of an interesting outcome that the ECB has mentioned that I kind of agree with. It's like, yes, like people are going to care about Bitcoin. People are going to want the number to go up, and that's going to be good for Bitcoin. And like, that's going to make governments and politicians kind of respect Bitcoiners and like kind of appeal to what Bitcoiners want. And I think the nations that don't create Bitcoin friendly policies are going to lose a lot of Bitcoin. There's going to lose a lot of Bitcoiners. And Bitcoin's easy to move, right? Like that's one of the major advantages of Bitcoin. It's highly portable. Like you can send Bitcoin from New York to Tokyo in, a couple hours paying $1 worth of fees, and you can move $1 billion. If you own $1 billion worth of real estate in New York, you're not going to be able to necessarily move that around the world. So real estate is going to be subject to property taxes by which you pay annually. Bitcoin is not like that. Bitcoin can easily move to a different jurisdiction. So jurisdictions are going to have to, help encourage Bitcoiners to come to them. And then hopefully those Bitcoiners will slowly deploy some of that Bitcoin over time into the various local economies. So yeah, the ECB paper and the Fed paper were interesting, like the high level abstracts that I read. But I think like they're kind of at like the capitulation stage where they're like, wow, like maybe the Bitcoiners were right all along, and like maybe this is going to be a big deal, and like we need to think about it more.
So it makes me think of, obviously, one of the other things recently was just the micro strategy or Saylor drama. I should probably say the Saylor drama more than anything. But what are your thoughts on, because to me, I think Saylor, obviously, when you're that big of a target, you kind of have to play the game in many different ways. That's at least my just rudimentary take on it of like, yeah, I mean, he's for the last year, I thought he got very libertarian, very like based with what he was saying. And then I felt like all of a sudden maybe someone said something to him and he was like, oh, you know what? I got to throw this out here too. That's at least what it seemed like from my perspective. So I don't read too much into it. However, one of the things he said over time, and I love your thoughts on it, is where, Bitcoin is going to be there to, I mean, the American government has a lot of the Bitcoin. We have a lot of mining here now. We've got, however they got the Bitcoin, America, we won't go into that right now, but that's a story for a different day. America has a lot of Bitcoin, a lot of mining here. Do you see a world, like what do you see, in this 10, 20-year time horizon when it comes to, will there be the two currencies, the dollar and Bitcoin, kind of ascending to like, hey, they're kind of ubiquitous, or like you can use either, or like, what do you see when you kind of look out into your glass ball over the coming, epochs, in the coming decades here?
Yeah, I've started to think about this a little more recently, and I think historically I've gone back and forth where, maybe like starting out potentially like in a naive way, I thought hyper Bitcoinization was right around the corner. Like the world is going to be using Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset and daily currency, and it's going to happen like really fast. But obviously now it's 2024, and Bitcoin is still a treasury reserve asset for a very, very small percentage of the world, and it's definitely by no means a daily currency that's accepted at Starbucks, Walmart, or whatever, or your local grocery store, or any sort of small business. And maybe that will be the way that Bitcoin continues to progress for the next couple decades. Like I like to think I'm pro America and I'm pro Bitcoin in the sense that maybe the dollar and Bitcoin are actually like in a very nice symbiotic relationship, where I think of the dollar as debt-based money. And when you have debt-based money, you need good collateral within the system to kind of keep the dollar system going. And right now, that good collateral, quote unquote, is things like real estate or just the government borrowing money, like the government's tax receipts, or high quality businesses, like businesses in the S&P 500, smaller businesses, etc. And I feel like adding Bitcoin into that collateral mix and enabling more dollars to effectively get created using Bitcoin as collateral is probably going to be something that becomes a very, very big industry over time. And and it could affect, in a way, like strengthen the dollar system, as long as some people still want to hold dollars. And I think some people like still will want to hold dollars, like especially like short term dollars. If Bitcoin continues to be extremely volatile, which I kind of expect it to be for probably, at least another decade, then it kind of does make sense to hold enough dollars in the short term to make sure you can meet your short term liabilities, whether that's like your mortgage payment, your rent, or if you own a building, you might have a mortgage payment on that or some sort of loan that you've taken out. And so like there might always be a case to hold at least a little bit of short-term dollars to meet your short-term liabilities. And then after that, you hold real assets, and Bitcoin might be the best real asset for a very long time horizon. And in a way, like that's already kind of what has happened like over the last 50 plus years with the dollar system. Like anyone that has a serious amount of wealth, they're not just sitting on cash under their mattress. Like they're also not sitting with cash in a checking or savings account. Like they've invested that wealth into the S&P 500, into real estate, into gold, into Bitcoin to some extent, if they're really wealthy or they're a Bitcoiner. And I think that like that's going to probably continue happening, where most wealthy people, again, just won't hold many dollars. Like that's not changing from what has been the case for the last 50 plus years. Everyone kind of knows you shouldn't hold a lot of dollars. You'll hold some still for, short-term liabilities, and you want to minimize volatility. But for your long-term wealth, it just makes a lot of sense to hold, something like Bitcoin. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I think it might play out. I think Saylor's perspective is probably like, he probably thinks that way as well. And I'm sure to some extent, like he obviously is recognizing the idea that if you go out there and you say hyper Bitcoinization is happening tomorrow, this is extremely disruptive to world governments, fiat money, the US dollar, then he's obviously going to have a pretty big target on his back, and maybe may not be able to do exactly what he's doing. And it's also like, yeah, like maybe that happens, but I think his perspective is like, that is like years and years still probably away. And there's no guarantee that that is exactly how this is going to play out. Maybe Bitcoin becomes a $20 trillion or $100 trillion asset, or $300 trillion asset, just like real estate. And like, we're kind of like, the dollar still exists despite the fact that real estate is worth $300 trillion. So it's like, maybe Bitcoin just becomes the same thing, and dollars are used for like short-term accounting and tax revenues. And like everyone that holds Bitcoin makes a lot of money. The United States remains the global power, which is probably good for the world, rather than like another nation emerging as the global power, or like pure chaos throughout the world. And so I think his perspective is like, let's not rock the boat. Like, let's take it day by day. Like there's a very, very high probability in his mind, in my mind too, that Bitcoin at the very least becomes digital gold. Once Bitcoin 15x's from where it is today, or 20x's from where it is today, and becomes digital gold, then Bitcoiners will have significantly more power than we have today. We'll probably have like more visibility into like how this world is actually playing out, and how this is disrupting, governments or fiat money or other things. And then it's going to be a lot harder to clamp down on, because it's so much bigger than it is today. So I think he's playing it one step at a time, which I think is the right thing to do. And he's also correct in the sense that like, there's no point of saying hyper Bitcoinization, or the dollar is going to die tomorrow, because we don't know if that's the case. It may not. That may be wrong.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on? I didn't even think of this until you were just saying this, because it feels like I've seen a little bit more stablecoin talk, and I know it's always out there, but I've seen some, whether it's Samson or Saylor talked about it a little bit. There's someone else recently that was bringing it up a little bit. Just even some developer friends that I have, that some guys who work at Jolt, stuff like that, where there's like, yeah, this is a very real part of the world. So but what you were saying is kind of where I go with it too, and that makes the case in a way, in an indirect way, for stablecoins, right? If you're going to have these fiat currencies that are going to exist, I mean, let's be logical in the sense that our government's going to just willingly give away that ability to have their own currencies, whether they're going to print it or not. That's that's another fight for another day. But to have their own currency, it just feels like we're going to enter that world. Maybe that's like you said with Saylor. So what do you think in the terms of like the stable coins and maybe the role that'll play with relationship to Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it's like, if you thought hyper Bitcoinization, or like, hyper Bitcoinization may be the wrong word I'm using here, in the sense that like Bitcoin can go up a lot, and that doesn't mean the dollar's going to disappear.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah. So stable coins, it's like Bitcoin's gone up a ton over the last, few years, yet the market cap of Tether and like USDC has also gone up a ton ever
Yep.
since, the last 5 years or so. And so
Yep.
it's like, that's kind of actually evidence to the argument that we were making right
Yes.
there, is like Bitcoin is honestly like strengthening the dollar, and it's adding demand for
Yep.
dollars for people using these stable coins and Africa or Asia or wherever, and then also using it as collateral for borrowing more money to buy Bitcoin, or doing whatever they want with the stable coins. So I think the market is going to continue to get bigger and bigger, and it's interesting seeing people like Howard Lutnick,
Mm.
who's the I forgot exactly what company he works for, but basically he works for the company that supposedly holds T-bills, which are like the dollars that back Tether. And he's going out on TV and saying like, hey, like we hold Tether's dollars. Tether has all of the money. And like, it's just crazy to think how far we've come, because like years back, people would be like, Tether is, a fraud. Like they don't have the dollars. Like it's all made up. Like this is, and people would say like, this is why Bitcoin is going up, because they're printing these fake dollars and buying Bitcoin. And for some reason, people are still holding the fake tethers. But in reality, like whether that happened or it didn't happen, it's pretty clear at this point that like Tether is like a real thing, and it has product market fit for people using it around the world. And it's getting bigger and bigger, whether it's Tether, USDC, or other stable coins. So to me, it seems like it's going to get bigger and bigger. And I think probably like the US government is taking note of it, and they like this. Like they want someone around the world holding
Hmm.
their bags for the debt that they're issuing. They need someone to buy this debt and to hold it in the form of something like a Tether stable coin, so they can issue more debt and effectively run a massive $1 trillion deficit. So I would imagine like Tether's going to get bigger and bigger. And it's probably just, something that continues to occur over time.
Yeah. It's I don't know who it was the other day. Someone was thinking that, because you made me think of the stablecoin thing, because and the more I think about it, the more that's the way I think it kind of plays out, at least in like maybe the next, few years, next decade or two. Because yeah, maybe when our kids or great grandkids, maybe it is just a Bitcoin world. But to all that, two things I'm thinking of. One of them is Bitcoin indirectly keeps these people honest, right? It's indirectly going to keep people honest, and it's forcing that hand of whether people have to then go into Tether. Because look, if you have a Howard Lutnick and these people saying, hey, no, they've got it. I mean, that's great for us. The people love freedom or the transparency or whatever it is, because now you're forcing the hand of companies or people or governments to be transparent, or whatever, show proof of reserves or whatever it is. You don't have to have hyper Bitcoinization technically in order for people to be transparent or show what's going on. I mean, there are arguments to that. Hey, if it just cleans up the world around us, then hey, you kind of win at the end of the day. And Bitcoin could go up to, like you said, 100 trillion to 300 trillion, just like real estate, and be an asset. So anyway, really, really fascinating. And I think that, like you said, it's going to happen more and more, where that will just continue happening. Man, that is really interesting. I hadn't kind of really thought of it like that. In saying all this, a couple more before I want to talk about Unchained here. What do you think? What are your thoughts on just Microsoft? So we kind of talked like even government level stuff like that. We talked about kind of the personal level a little bit too, but and then MicroStrategy a little bit on the corporate level. But what do you think in terms of Microsoft? I look at like just like even Berkshire, right? 300 billion ish, we'll call it, on the balance sheet, or maybe not quite that yet, but you have all this cash sitting there. Microsoft, looking to do it. It just feels like we're at this inflection point, which you alluded to earlier, of maybe the older generations, starting to enter their sunset in a way. And then the younger generations, what if there's 10% of that cash that goes into, for Berkshire, goes into Bitcoin, that's $30 billion, it's just stuff like that. Microsoft, what are your thoughts in just that corporate level? Whether it's Sailor showing the way with being a treasury reserve asset, Fold now, there's all these companies. I mean, Unchained, what you guys are doing, helping, as you made me think of too earlier, with lending, right? And some things like that. So I'd love for you to kind of touch on what you're seeing just at a corporate level, and just your thoughts on what some of these companies are doing with being a treasury reserve asset.
Yeah, seeing that SEC document that they released, I think it was sometime last week, of one of their proposals was for shareholders was invest a percentage of cash or something into Bitcoin. And like the board at the time had said, they do not recommend doing this, but it is interesting and good to see that it is like something that's being talked about, like in an official document for, I think it's like the third largest U.S. public company, which is quite massive, $3 trillion company. And I guess like for those that don't remember, like this is kind of, it's not going to be exactly the same, but it's kind of exactly what happened to MicroStrategy. I remember like the summer of 2020, basically like this random SEC, approved document comes out from random company called MicroStrategy, which no one had really heard of. I think at the time it was probably $1 billion company. And like one paragraph within the document, it basically said MicroStrategy is considering adopting another asset other than dollars as their treasury reserve asset. And they listed like the S&P 500, they listed gold, they listed, corporate paper, like short-term corporate debt. They listed Bitcoin, and everyone kind of freaked out about it on Twitter at the time. And like, oh my gosh, like a public company might actually buy Bitcoin. Like this is crazy. And then like we little did everyone know that like it was going to be Michael Saylor, and he literally was going to go on a full rampage of buying as much Bitcoin as humanly possible, and like basically creating a leveraged Bitcoin ETF. So like you never know like with these things of who necessarily like wanted that in that document that Microsoft released, and you never know like what Microsoft shareholders are really going to do, and like what the largest ones are going to advocate for. But again, it's like Microsoft is such a larger company. I kind of a difficult time seeing them go full sailor mode where they just, empty their cash, buy a bunch of Bitcoin, start doing convertible notes, buy a bunch of Bitcoin, issue equity, buy a bunch of Bitcoin. I think they should do that for sure. And they would absolutely crush it if they did. And Bitcoin would absolutely soar, but probably a very low probability that happens, but they should do it. At least that's what I think. But it's interesting because it's like, we are now at a stage where like I think like 94% of all Bitcoin have already been mined. Global adoption in my mind is still like significantly less than 1%. If we start to see like the Magnificent Seven or these large tech companies actually go deep into Bitcoin and like adopt it as their treasury reserve asset and begin accumulating it very aggressively, then like this bull market is going to be absolutely insane. So yeah, I mean, it seems like it will be, who knows exactly what's going to happen with Microsoft, especially over the next few months. But, I really hope that they do decide to buy at least a few $1 billion worth of Bitcoin. And, hopefully maybe, their CEO or someone else on their executive team is talking to Saylor and other people within the industry. And they recognize like how, much of a breakthrough this is in terms of like preserving long-term wealth and how early it is and how much upside there remains just by sitting on cold storage Bitcoin. And I think if someone internally recognizes that, or enough people internally recognize that, and the price starts running up, then it could just be they could be the domino that get, Apple, Meta, and other companies within the S&P 500 to really follow through and kind of do the same thing. Because when it's also like, it's so interesting where in business, I feel like you don't necessarily want people to copy you because business is highly competitive. And if you're doing one product and Apple comes out with a similar product, you're going to be like, oh, dang, like that's bad. Like my margins are going to get compressed. They could build a better product. Like there's so much to worry about. Whereas Bitcoin is just this very positive sum game where Saylor wants people to copy him. Like no other business actually wants another business to copy their exact same strategy. And if all of these businesses start copying the Michael Saylor playbook and adopting Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset, then like everyone wins. And that's like a beautiful thing and a beautiful outcome. And it might start happening. Who knows?
Man, it's just so wild. It's absolutely wild. Man, I really hope, and we've talked a little bit about like the white pill, black pill, just kind of hope, pessimism, and just balancing those two. And it's like, I really hope, naturally humans have had a very hard time learning from history, right? Like we just seem like we want to get kicked in the face 1,000 times before we realize we're in a fight. And boy, do I hope that it can be, because two things generally, get people into Bitcoin. It's fear and greed, right? It's the FOMO, or it's like, hey, our bank accounts got frozen. So it's like, it's either one of the two things. And man, I know we all do Bitcoin. We hope that people will start realizing, recognizing that these patterns and get in before really ridiculous things have to happen, and then people realize. So just you're making me think of that. And we talked about just freedom money a little bit too, and Bitcoin here in America. In saying that, I want to get somewhat political here for a second, not to get polarizingly political, but I want you to play out, because this interview will probably come out right around the election here. It could be a day before, maybe a few days after, but I want you to kind of lay out, before we talk about Unchained here for a couple minutes, what if Trump wins, what are your thoughts kind of going forward in terms of could sound money, the dollar, Bitcoin, and then if Harris wins, because I think that this could be even 4 years from now in a way too. Like this is kind of like this fight that just keeps playing out. But what are your two scenarios you're thinking or have been thinking about if either side kind of gets control?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think starting off, I would say that neither candidate really understands Bitcoin. Like no candidate is obviously like a full-on Bitcoin maximalist. With that said, I also think that like there's clearly one candidate that would be better for Bitcoin in the short to medium term and probably even long term, and better for America. I would say Trump would be that candidate. I mean, he spoke in Nashville at Bitcoin 2024. He announced with Senator Lummis's help, like he announced this idea of a strategic Bitcoin stockpile, which would be great for America because, who's to say that we are going to have the dollar as the world reserve currency forever, and we're going to be able to issue trillions of dollars of new debt, and there's going to be someone to buy that, and that we're going to be able to use that to our advantage for the next century. Like that may not be the case. We need to hedge our bet with a theoretically, if the internet and cryptography enabled us to discover a new superior form of money or a new superior treasury reserve asset, we should be ahead of the curve and buy that asset with the money that we can literally create out of thin air and waste it on so much, worthless things. We need to be buying Bitcoin with that. And so I think Trump has the right people around him that he's starting to at least be on the somewhat right direction. And I think if he got elected, he would have smart people around him that would be explaining him like how important this might be. And I think as Bitcoin, ripped after the election and, throughout 2025, I think he would be all aboard the Bitcoin train. Like you've had, with the Biden administration, you've had things like Operation Choke Point, where it's been pretty clear that like banks and other financial services firms were like, censored and shut down effectively by the administration and kind of blamed on like the banking crisis for insolvency. But in reality, like it was kind of like a coordinated attack on crypto. You had like the SEC, SEC could have approved a Bitcoin ETF in like 2013. They waited until 2024 to quote unquote protect investors. Like that was the best asset you could have bought from 2013 to 2024. And the entity that, is supposed to be out there protecting innocent retail investors forced innocent retail investors to miss the biggest trade of the last 10 years, which is like absolutely ridiculous. And so now that exists, and thankfully it does exist for more and more people to just get access to Bitcoin, get their first few, little exposure to Bitcoin. It's a great tool. I think that like, the Harris administration hopefully would be more pro Bitcoin. And I think they would be, because like, kind of like I said, earlier, it's like, there's no incentive to be anti Bitcoin. Like you can be, but you're going to lose votes in the long run. And that's not a good strategy. I think again, Trump would be a lot better. And I personally hope he wins. And I think that would be good for both America and Bitcoin. But I also think that both candidates are in no shape or form ever going to balance the budget. They're going to continue running $1 trillion annual deficits. And that's also going to be good for Bitcoin. So it's like long term, it's probably a win-win. I think Trump will do more for Bitcoin in the short term. And I think Trump will be more open to like really protecting the rights of Bitcoin holders, whether that's the right to self-custody or just the right to own a claim on Bitcoin. I think that Trump is objectively better for Bitcoin. I don't think many people would disagree with that, but at the end of the day, I don't think it matters. Decades from now, it may not matter too much for Bitcoin itself. I think America will be better off with Trump, but long term, Bitcoin's probably going to continue to exist. It's probably going to continue to win. And I hope America, fully embraces Bitcoin and makes Bitcoin home, it continues to be open to Bitcoin and continues to enable people to buy as much Bitcoin as possible effectively.
Yeah. I mean, boy, that's the thing we can hope for. Like you said, at the end of the day, no matter who it is in power, because whether it's now or 4 years from now, or you just continue being a beacon of liberty like it's been, and for Bitcoin, for sound money. So, insane. I know we're getting towards the end here. What I would love for you to kind of talk on Unchained, where you're at right now. You've been at numerous Bitcoin, platforms, companies. So I'd love for you to kind of spill the details on what you've been working at with Unchained. You've been doing, interviewing people, doing stuff as well, putting out a ton of great content as well. So I'd love for you to kind of touch on what you guys are working at Unchained, what you're doing there specifically, then also Unchained, what you guys are up to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked at Unchained for now over a year. I host the Bitcoin Frontier podcast there, where just like we have on great Bitcoin focused guests, talking about all things Bitcoin, all things markets.
Really yeah.
Unchained in of itself is one of the reasons why I joined Unchained, is because I'm super passionate about helping people hold Bitcoin, but then not only just hold Bitcoin, but make sure that they can securely hold it for decades. Because the history of Bitcoin has been, people want exposure to the price, which is completely fair, but custody of the asset is kind of an afterthought. And it takes the price going up for them to really think about, wait, am I holding this correctly? Like, am I going to lose it? Is my custodian going to rug me, like Mt. Gox or BlockFi or Celsius? And so Unchained is effectively one of the best ways to hold Bitcoin, because Unchained clients in a personal vault, Bitcoin vault setup, as an Unchained client, you hold 2 keys and Unchained holds 1 key. And you need 2 keys to move your Bitcoin. And if you happen to make a mistake and you lose one of your keys, or one of your keys gets hacked or stolen or whatnot, then you still haven't lost access to your Bitcoin. So it's kind of a good middle ground between, an ETF and then a full self-custodial solution, where like, if you have a cold card or a Trezor or whatnot, like that's great. And those are compatible with an Unchained vault. But if you have all of your Bitcoin on a single key, and Bitcoin goes to $400,000, and you're like, wow, this is a lot of wealth to be holding on this one little device. And if this device gets hacked, or if my seed phrase gets found, then that's kind of scary. Like it's a single point of failure. And so what Unchained does is helps people and businesses eliminate single points of failure by making any single key not subject to you losing your Bitcoin. You can lose a key and not lose all of your Bitcoin. And so I think as the price of Bitcoin goes up, people try to make sure that they're not going to lose all of their Bitcoin, or their Bitcoin's not going to get stolen, or their Bitcoin's not going to get hacked. And I joined Unchained because I think, 1, people should buy a lot of Bitcoin. And 2, if you're going to buy a lot of Bitcoin, you need to make sure that you're actually going to be able to hold it for generations or centuries. And I think Unchained is the best way to do that.
Great stuff, Joe. Thank you so much for coming on today, being a playable and a character, and seeing non-playable characters. Any last words of advice? And also, please share where people can find you online.
Yeah, absolutely. Brandon, thanks so much for inviting me on and enabling me to take some time to do this and talk about Bitcoin. I always, as many people on your show probably do, they love to talk about Bitcoin. You can find me on Twitter or YouTube. On Twitter, my handle is III Capital, or Joe Burnett. And then on YouTube, if you type in Joe Burnett Bitcoin, I should be like one of the first results for that. And yeah, I mean, closing thoughts, I would say expect Bitcoin to be volatile. It's been volatile throughout history. It's going to continue to be volatile going forward. Don't buy Bitcoin to get rich quick. It's not a get rich quick scheme. It's what's happening is we're living through the monetization of Bitcoin, which means there's going to be massive parabolic bull markets, and there's going to be absolutely brutal, devastating bear markets. And so my general advice is, if typically don't use leverage. If you're going to use leverage, be extremely conservative, and have a very, very long time horizon. Don't expect to buy Bitcoin and in the next 12 months make $1 million or $10 million or 100,000, whatever is a lot of money to you. Buy Bitcoin and prepare to hold it through 80% drawdowns or more, and forget you own it for the next 4 years. Bitcoin is long-term savings technology, and the world is in the process of adopting it. And that's going to probably continue to be an extremely volatile process.
Great words of wisdom. Again, thank you, Joe, so much. We'll link to all your stuff in the description and your report as well. Your wealth is melting away, to Unchained, to your socials, everything. So again, appreciate you for being a playable character, brother. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon.
If you like this interview we just did with Joe Burnett, then you're going to love the one we just did with Tom Luongo about everything Bitcoin, gold, macro, freedom, sound money, or the one we just did with Joe Consorti talking about the election and Bitcoin and what's to come. Check it out here. Come on.